Welcome back to the next section of Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. Now, last time we saw the new age that we kind of looked ahead and we saw the new age that Quigley says World War II would create for the world. Now we're going to talk about the actual sequences of World War II itself, how it all went down and what was going on in the background. And there's quite a few nuggets, but you need to thank me because this chapter with this 200 pages was extremely boring and not something that is fun to read. So even if you're a military historian, I can't imagine that this was something pleasurable. It's just so boring and technical, but nevertheless interspersed through are little bits of nuggets that are relevant information. So Quigley says there were three stages basically to the war. The first is, and by the way, I actually have read the book, so here you go. Here's my notes. As you can see, it is Tragedy and Hope. It's not made up for those that think that I'm making things up. So we have, let's see, what are the three stages here? Basically, you're going to have what he calls the aggressors, the movement of the aggressors being the Axis powers. You're going to have the Allied responses, and then you're going to have basically what he calls it the ebb and then the flow and then the tide, where the energy and success begins to shift away from German success back over to Allied success. And so there's a lot of different angles that Quigley takes. He talks about the alterations in warfare, and that World War II was basically fully entering into the modern world insofar as technology would play a much larger role in combat than it ever did in any previous war. I mean, obviously technology has always played some role, and if you read Machiavelli's Art of War, then you'll know that he talks about that being the book. Well, the editors of my copy talk about that being the book that really transitioned out of classical medieval warfare into the more modern warfare period with regiments and so forth. And then, so basically World War II is what takes us out of that older period of warfare and warfare tradition and into modern warfare. And what we're going to see that's very interesting is that this is going to include from a character, an Italian general named Duhay. It's going to include the idea of civilian bombing and strategic bombing. That's going to be a new idea pioneered at World War II. And it's going to be pioneered by the Allies of all people. So interestingly, that even Quigley discusses the fact that it's not the Axis powers that really take to this idea of bombing civilians. And again, one of the myths, I think, of World War II gets exploded here. It's not to say that the Axis powers were good guys. They committed all these atrocities as well. Both sides are committing atrocities, is the point. And so we move away from traditional into non-traditional warfare and strategic bombing as the first thing he talks about. Now, there's interesting because, as I mentioned last time, there was all of this propaganda on the part of Britain and London that they were basically coaxing Hitler into moving into all these territories. And they explicitly said, I'm on page 667, we will not aid Germany when Hitler attacks. And so they would engage in a lot of psychological warfare. British planes roamed over Germany dropping leaflets for propaganda. French patrols ventured into the space between the Maginot Line and the German West Wall, but no support was given to Poland. Strict orders were issued that the British Air Force was not to bomb any German forces, and that shows you that Hitler's doing what they wanted him to do. They wanted him to move excuse me, into these various countries. He says, through the Low Countries, the return for German coal was the same road. These exchanges between Germany and French the French were supporting Germany with iron ore to make their weapons, and they were told not to attack any of these supply lines. So obviously the real situation is that they wanted Hitler to become what he became, this power, this threat. And it's the same model that we see with Western governments even today with all of their supposed enemies. They're all enemies that are created by the Pentagon. Now, there's, again, what we call the stage one, the Sitzkrieg, and that Germany could only be beaten by economic measures at this early stage in 1939. Now, if Germany could only be beaten by economic measures at this stage, why were they supporting him with money and supplies? It makes no sense. Well, it does make sense if you want a war, but that's what Quigley says. So there we have a contradiction between we know what the Allies are saying. They begin economic blockades after Hitler. So we see the build-up continue, and page 712 is important because I want to point out the war scam. Now, we've all probably heard of General Smedley Butler saying that war is a racket, and he's right, because what the America First people were saying was correct, essentially. They point out that the defense contractors had a monopoly, and that they were behind, monopolistic corporations were behind the war, and Quigley talks about how it is kind of a scam. He says, accordingly, most industrialists, especially the largest ones, had close contracts with the government. Especially, he says this was most emphatic following Roosevelt's statement in 1940 that America's goal was to produce 50,000 warplanes a year. This new industry would be a fantastic figure, and it was called a New Deal propagandist trick. America's plane production in the next 5 years was about 6 times this and reached 100,000 just in 1944. These results were achieved because the government paid for 9/10 of the new factories and compelled the modern mass production methods that were adopted by what was still, even in 1940, prior to that, a handicraft industry. So you have the shift away from handmade, handcrafted planes into mass production, and that's one of the main things that World War II would do, is to shift through social engineering the whole industry of America into a war-based economy. Now, even World War I didn't do that. And when I say war-based, I'm not saying that it's always based around just warfare. I'm saying that the mechanics and the way that industry was done was completely altered in these specific arenas like air production and oil production and so forth through the war. So it has that tremendous effect. And it's ironic that he says that FDR paid for it by the government. The government doesn't pay for anything. The taxpayers pay for it. That's when they say government, they meaning the taxpayers. And since the other revealing Quigley quotes that we saw before told us the truth about FDR, that when he says the government's paying for it, it's not just the taxpayers paying for it. This is future generations paying for it to the bankers. So the debt was all created on the part of FDR from the central bankers. And so that's how the war is a scam, because it supposedly is going to create a new economy, but what it does is it more so shifts and reorganizes the existing society into something new. And that's what World War II would do. And Quigley's going to have at the end of this section that we're doing, at the end of this 200-page chunk that we're doing, he's going to have a whole chapter that discusses this, how World War II changed everything and essentially created the New World Order. Now, I mean, the people behind the New World Order already existed. They were behind World War I, but World War I did not significantly alter life in the way that World War II did, and that's what's the key here. Now, the FDR administration engages in intense propaganda through this, what they call the defense of democracy, and the 4 freedoms, the arsenal of 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, and freedom from fear. That is like the dumbest propaganda ever, but it worked apparently because people bought into this and they thought that, oh yes, we are here for the defense of freedom, even though Quigley will say that when the Allies defeated the Germans and moved in, especially in Germany, they set up a temporary military police dictatorship to ensure democracy. So talk about Orwell. Now industry gains tremendously from war. The Packards, General Electric, many of these big corporations that we know about, IBM, this is page 715, they did great from this Lend-Lease program because they created all this stuff and handed it over to the Brits, and basically everybody, the Lend-Lease program was that we'll give you all this junk and then you pay us all this crap back later. And so what we see is that the UK really didn't have the resources and the wealth and the machinery to pull off World War II. They needed the engine of America, and that's why it was so important for the British agents like Intrepid and Bill Donovan and MI6 and the Cordes Circle and Ian Fleming to convince the American administration to really, really get behind this effort. So they create the Atlantic Charter, the Allies do, with the League of Nations, and there's a post-war plan to replace the League of Nations, which will be the UN. Quigley mentions that on page 718. And they already talk about the Soviet dominance of all of the eastern chunk of the globe, pretty much. They can, Soviets, communists, you can have all that Eastern Europe stuff. Just let us have all this Western stuff. So we can already see they're strategizing World War II. Again, from the 3 block to the 2 block. This is what the wars do, is they re-engineer and create the 3 block and then the 2 block model. And by the 2 block, I'm talking about the Cold War. And Quigley's also going to say that what both of these wars do, as we've said many times, this is the key to the 20th century, is the Atlanticist powers decide we've got to knock out our 2 rivals, Germany and Russia. How do we do that? 2 giant wars will weaken and tens of millions of people died. The Russians, Soviets fighting, tens of millions of people die in, I think 40 million is Quigley's figure on World War II. And the majority of those are Germans and other ethnic nationalities. That's the majority of who dies. Germans, Russians, and other ethnic nationalities. Not that many, by comparison, U.S. and British soldiers died, or civilians. So what you see there is that this massive war project, it doesn't just benefit industry, it also weakens tremendously Germany and Russia. And that's why the Soviets, after World War II, had to be built up and aided by the West, as we know from Anthony Sutton and as we know from the CFR archives and many other sources that talk about this openly. The Russians could not have been the threat that they were without all this aid to the West. What? An exact repeat of what we saw with Hitler. So what they did with Hitler in aiding him, giving him all this industry, resources, iron, oil, money, they do the same thing then with the Soviets. And so at the top level, you have to remember that it's a joke, it's a scam, it's a hoax, and they're in on it at the top level. Okay. And then you've got all these people under that, in the American pyramid and in the Soviet pyramid, fighting it out, battling it out in the Cold War and different skirmishes and stuff. And that's real. They're really, because they believe in all this stuff, right? And they think that this group of people across the world is their enemy. When it's the people at the top, the industrialists and the bankers, who build up the Soviets and aid them such that they can be in some degree a potential threat, at least in the lower rungs of these 2 pyramids, right? With the CIA fighting the KGB and so forth. Now, Hitler moves into Ukraine, and this is strategic for Hitler because he sees that Ukraine is important as little Russia, right? So what does he want to do to create Ukraine as a nation state, right? So this has precedence earlier than Hitler, but this is why you have a pro-Nazi movement in the Ukraine, and we've seen reflections of this recently in the Pravi sector, right sector movement, in terms of the West funding that to, again, remove Russian influence in the Ukraine and in Kiev. And so that's another repeat of World War II. So a lot of what we're seeing today in geopolitics amazingly reflects World War II and the Cold War as well. Now, moving on, we have an interesting statement here. The Nazis do starve their war prisoners, page 726, Soviet prisoners. Averell Harriman comes into the picture as a key player in terms of industry. Let's see. Roosevelt and Churchill decided to send a full-scale economic mission to Moscow to determine Russia's needs. This mission was headed by Averell Harriman and Lord Beaverbrook. I wonder if he got made fun of for that name. Probably not if he's a lord. But they were in Moscow for 3 days at the end of 1941 and signed another agreement with the Soviets. So more aid to the Soviets. So that part of the reason the Soviets were built up is World War II. Right? But they also needed more building up after World War II. So now we come to chapters 15 and Japan. Japan was divided over previous wars that they'd had. The invasion of Manchuria, fighting China. There was the Sino-Japanese War. So Japan was not in the best of states. And the West decided to put economic warfare embargoes on Japan at first. And the U.S. also instituted the National Defense Act to not just promote economic warfare against Japan, but also to they also had, of course, internment camps for Japanese Americans in the U.S., which is a bit ridiculous because the premise, being that, they're all going to be spies. Now, give me a break. Oil embargo on them. There's a lot of skirmishes in the Indochina region, and the U.S. and Japan trying to control different sections of the Pacific Theater of War. This is ultimately, of course, going to lead to Pearl Harbor, which is going to lead to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Japan ends up being successful in taking those isles from Singapore to New Guinea to Malay. Japan was successful in setting up a defense perimeter in these regions. And it's very interesting that this is a global war, and so that you can see how they needed a global war for global realignment, right? And that's what one of the things that this whole engineered conflict does is that it's a global scale, more so even than World War One. We're going to get to later the Battle of Midway, which is going to be a turning point for the Japanese in terms of the defeat, because it's going to lead to the dropping of the bombs. So there's a Japanese trap. There's a bunch of Pearl Harbor, there's a bunch of carriers that are sunk in the Japanese theater of war. In the West, even though Japan puts up a pretty good fight, the West ends up dominating that region. Other warfare takes place in El Amin, which is Egypt, and Quigley says the British clung to their lifeline throughout the Mediterranean to protect their defenses from Gibraltar to Malta to Egypt. Malta is interesting because there's been a long history of Western and British intelligence operations in Malta, and I've only found like one or two references on this. This was like 2 or 3 years ago when I was researching it, so I'm sure you could find more stuff on this now. But the island of Malta is situated in the middle of an Axis supply line from Italy to Africa, so that's why it was very important in World War II as a strategic location. But it gets the shit bombed out of it basically as a result. And I don't know, there's just a lot of really interesting espionage and intrigues about the history of Malta. I think you can find a good piece that Mark Hacker translated at Espionage History Archive on Malta and the CIA, and the sort of connections with the black nobility of Europe. Very, very good piece. So maybe I'll link that below if I remember. So, the U.S. decides at this point, after this conflict in El Alamein in Egypt, that we've got to have a full-scale. Rommel heard of a large-scale American invasion in French North Africa, and then the Allies decide it's time for a full-out, all-out invasion of Europe. And by the way, that invasion of North Africa, also what we see today, AFRICOM, right? That's the same thing that was going on at this time, World War II. At that time, it was called Operation Torch, and this was the machinations we're told of. The Anglo-American invasion of North Africa was known as Operation Torch, and it was under the overall command of General Eisenhower. Hitler's reactions to Torch were vigorous. All of France was occupied by Nazis, and the efforts to capture the French fleet at Toulon were frustrated. And so, in this way, Rommel, the famous German general, who had been forced out of El Ahila in Egypt, was able to withdraw westward into Tunisia. And so we start to see, secret meeting at Casablanca, if you think of the Humphrey Bogart film, which actually does take place in this time period. Casablanca, one of the most famous films of all time, of course. Roosevelt, Churchill, and their staff met in secret at Casablanca, and this dealt with plans for the cross-channel invasion of Europe. So Casablanca is important for the decision to invade Europe, a full-scale Allied invasion of Europe. U.S. continues to send aid to Russia in this period, $10 billion in aid to the evil, dark, atheist empire of the commies. $10 billion in aid in 1940s money. Give me a break. Closing in on Germany, 1943 to 45. This is where we start to get the shift in the tide. 1943 is key for the Germans beginning to experience significant defeats. So Germany had been doing well in terms of the warfare for the first couple of years, for first several years, and then things start to shift and take a turn elsewise. And this is where we get discussions again of we've got to have this new international order of United Nations to control the post-war situation. And that's the auspices, at least, for what the UN is going to be created for. That's, of course, not what it is. It's a giant social engineering propaganda tool for the enforcement of Huxley's Brave New World. And, of course, Huxley's family was very influential in UNESCO and the UN and so forth. But at this point, the auspices for the UN are to maintain post-war security, and hence the creation of the UN Security Council. Now, as we said, the key aim here of both of these wars was to weaken Germany and Russia, and these are the two main threats to the Atlanticist powers. And Quigley says this on page 757. The Soviet Union accepted the terms of the British alliance in 1942, and their suspicions of the West were still high. Their relations with Britain became increasingly unfriendly and reaching a critical stage in 1943. In Moscow, there was fear that the West wished to protract the war with both Germany and the Soviet Union to bleed them to death. Well, that's partly true, exactly. It was feared that this would end. This end could be obtained if the American supplies to Russia were placed at a sufficiently high level to keep Russia fighting in the war, but sufficiently high only to allow her to defeat Germany. To avoid this, Moscow continued to insist on the need to increase the Lend-Lease program assistance. And they were also worried then about the Anglo-American invasion of Europe because they thought, well, this would result in the post-war dominance of the Allied powers. So the USSR is, now this is what's key. Before Pearl Harbor, the Russians could not conceive that the United States would grant sufficient aid to Russia to permit a speedy defeat of Hitler. And since there was such a policy, it would leave the victorious Soviet armies supreme in Eastern Europe and placed probably also in Central Europe. So the USSR is placed in power, and the Soviets can't, according to Quigley, they can't believe this. But it's by design. And that's because the Soviets, at least at certain levels, probably not at the tip top, but at certain levels, couldn't believe that the West, their supposed enemy, would want them to have all this giant section of the globe. And that's what they'll get at Yalta and Potsdam following the war. And so the Reds, it is decided, will get all of Eastern Europe. Oh, that's so sweet of the Allies to just hand over all of Eastern Europe to the evil empire of the atheists, right? Mussolini in this period experiences his fall. Il Duce is ousted for the return of an Italian king who is an agent of the British. He's straight out of London. And the Germans then provide this bizarre, outlandish rescue mission where they, I guess rendition is it called? Extraction, where they extract Mussolini from prison and take him off to wherever, his island of hookers or something. We start to see Allied victories and then the creation of AMGOT, the Allied military government of occupied territory, where the liberated enter into a police state dictatorship under the Allies, again to ensure democracy. Remember FDR's 4 freedoms. Well, here's your 4 freedoms with a police state boot. We hear all this about the Stasi and about the brown shirts and the Germans, and then here's the Allies coming in when they set up their government doing the exact same thing. So don't buy into this goofy propaganda. Quigley goes to great lengths to mention Axis atrocities, which I don't doubt the Axis atrocities to be real, but scant mention of Allied atrocities, although he will mention the Soviet guilt in the Katyn massacre, which was a PSYOP, false flag, on the Nazis. So where they took several thousand officers and killed them and made it look like the Germans did it, but it was actually the Soviets that done it. So here we have a wild admission on page 769. It's very important, where Quigley says, while the military efforts of the Anglo-Americans were passing from victory to victory in 1943, a very ominous situation was arising behind the scenes with the Soviet Union. The decision in Washington seems to have been that every effort would be made through wartime concessions to the Soviet Union to obtain cooperation in a post-war international organization, and that all its territorial problems would be left to the post-war period. The Soviet Union must seek to ensure its post-war security by certain satellite and buffer states. So here you have no New World Order comes out of World War II by Quigley's admission. The Soviet Union imposing Soviet citizenship on the inhabitants of Poland, for example, forced over 1 million of them to go into other parts of Russia to work in the mines, factories, and farms. Now, Quigley is at he goes to great lengths to discuss Axis slave labor. He doesn't really go into depths describing the Soviet and Allied use of camps and slave labor. So once again, we see Quigley, the propagandist, coming through. Germany in debt, and once again repeated World War I with reparations. World War II, they've already decided at the Tehran conference what the money situation is going to be post-war, and how all these how the Germans are going to be in debt for the next generation. So once again, what we just saw with World War One. Another repeat World War II. Agents of the bankers are behind this. No secret. Quigley's open about that. They also make the decision that there can be no more isolation, no more America first. We live in the global world, global security. The Cold War demands that we can never have nationalism and isolationism, quote unquote. Again, we're a global economy now. We got to have a global war, and it's inhumane to have isolationism and nationalistic views because you're part of it. You're a global citizen. So the utter irrational nature of this morality, right? The morality is that the declaration of the Tehran conference was so significant that the Americans had to promise to never relapse into isolationism again. And now the irrational, contradictory, hypocritical nature of this morality is evident, I think, in all of the global conflicts of the U.S. in the last several decades. All of the invasions, all the proxy wars, all the special operations, all the black ops, all the coup regime changes, which Quigley will mention at the end of this section, by the way. How hypocritical is that in relationship to what the Tehran conference says about so, in other words, if you want to be an isolationist and be concerned with your own nation's interests, that's bad. But when we take over and our CFR runs, CIA runs things, we're going to make sure that there are countless dozens of conflicts, proxy wars, coup regime changes, CIA operations, militias, guerrillas that we're all going to fund and participate in, but that's good, right? So again, there's no morality in geopolitics. There's only pragmatic power relations, and that's what's key. When you see the morality come into geopolitics, you understand that it's propaganda. I mean, at the level of how things play out. I'm not saying that there's no such thing as morality, or that there aren't wicked nations and less wicked nations. I'm just saying that the way that it plays out, you can't believe somebody like FDR saying that the four freedoms, or that's just propaganda. And Quigley says that. So there's a lot of Russian intrigues in Iran. That gets very deep, very complicated. It goes back to the time of the czars. Mark Hackert has some really great articles on this and specific spy stories in relationship to Iran and Russia and the West at Espionage History Archive. You can also read Mark Curtis's book Secret Affairs that touches on a lot of this as well. Now, Iran and Yugoslavia end up already divided at this Tehran conference. In 1942, the UK USSR make this Iran deal, and Iran at this period is completely run by the West, right? As the British intelligence have been there for forever, and that's why it's another hotbed of espionage and geopolitical operations. Now, what's key here is that in Yugoslavia, the West aids Tito. They could have aided royalists. There was the royalist guy, Mihailovich, who represented the forces of royalism and Serbian centralism, social conservatism. No, who does the West give all their aid to and support in London? Tito, the communist. Once again, total nonsense. Now, we see here the rise of the rocket program. Page 785. This is not going to be that, according to Quigley, instrumental in the war. The rockets don't do that great. Like only 10, 20, 30% of the ICBMs and rockets that are launched actually hit their targets at this period. So the V1 and V2 rocket program is new on the scene, according to Quigley here on page 785, but they don't do very well. The V1s are kind of the beta model, and then you get the V2s, which are a little bit larger blast radius. But this is interesting because he says there are 2,300 of them. He says actually did hit London on the part of the German rocket programs. But this is not that successful. It also is interesting because this is the background to Ian Fleming's novel Moonraker, which you've heard, if you listen to Jay's analysis regularly, you've heard me talk about it many times. It'll be in my book as well, Esoteric Hollywood. There's a section on Moonraker and the V2 rocket program. But Hitler's government is in teetering at this point. There's several assassination plots, supposedly. Of course, the most famous being Valkyrie, Operation Valkyrie, which is Count von Stauffenberg and others, including Rommel, who engage in this plot to assassinate Hitler by setting a briefcase bomb next to his desk. It doesn't work. We all know this. And there's several thousand generals are rounded up in this coup attempt and are assassinated, but they allow Rommel to commit suicide, which is interesting because he was so admired, I guess. And this is page 787. But it sounds like an MI6 style plot here. He doesn't say that, but he does talk about connections between London and Ribbentrop, and that going on in the background of this plot to assassinate Hitler. But so I would guess this was some kind of MI6 thing. It also could have been too, if depending on what degree Hitler is secretly a British agent. I guess that's debatable, I know. But if that is the case, then it could be as well that Ribbentrop or somebody else tipped him off. And so this coup then would be a kind of false flag, or the bomb attempt would be a kind of staged thing to out all the people that would be involved in trying to get rid of Hitler, so it would actually aid Hitler. That's a possibility. Quigley doesn't say that. I don't know what happened. But it is interesting. And you see that in the Tom Cruise movie from a few years ago called Valkyrie. Not a bad movie, actually. Now, de Gaulle is made a provisional president of France during this period when he is successful in, I guess, outing the Vichys. And then we have the Battle of the Bulge and the event, again, the Nazis are really sort of teetering here. The Red Symphony, I think, is a good way to talk about it, according to, I think there's a book on that a friend of mine, Jason, sent me. I haven't read it yet, but it's a good way to talk about what Quigley talks about here on page 790, which is that giant aid continues to go to the Soviets. In general, the Anglo-Americans recognize the Russian need for security along their western frontier. And so they're given Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and not Greece, but they are given Yugoslavia. So Russian security in Eastern Europe could be assured if the victorious powers, including Russia, could retain their unity. The way to retain the unity and security post-World War II is through the United Nations Security Council. So there you have it. And then Quigley says, once again, that this is setting the stage for the Cold War on the next page. So again, it's engineered. They had already made these decisions prior to the end of the war. So the spheres of interest, power balance is the auspices for all this, right? But then the Reds are given the entire Eastern Bloc for security. Aid continues to the rise of the Reds. So how did this work to the advantage of the Anglo-Americans, the Atlanticists? The 3 block down to the 2 block. East and West, communism versus capitalism. Both controlled in the dialectic. And this is page 793. So the spheres of interest is crucial because the argument is that we've got to give all of these Eastern Bloc regions to the Soviets so that we can have global security. That's what the UN's here for. But what's really going on is that the security argument is a facade to create the 2-power dialectic. And remember, prior to this, we'd had a multipolar world, right? 3-block world, which is achieved after World War I. Now we're getting the dialectical, bipolar world. So at Yalta, the famous meeting, giant chunk of the globe is handed over to the Soviets. Greece goes into a liberal republican setting. This is a Masonic Republic in Greece. You go, Philip Sherrard in his book Greek East and Latin West has a chapter on the Masonic revolutions in Greece. I mean, so it's really a tragedy here that half the world, a big, large third of the world, large chunk of the world is handed over to the Soviets, to the communists. I mean, that's how dirty dealing the people that we're talking about are. And what do we have here? The creation of the IMF, and the World Bank, and the UN, right? All at the same period here, coming out of Yalta and Potsdam, is several other smaller conferences and meetings. This is page 796. And Quigley says, what is the point of all this? Well, here it is. The purpose of these organizations and resolutions provided the post-war organization of a one-world idealism. There you go. If Germany was... Now, this is funny. There's a bit of propaganda here. Quigley says that he constantly says the Germans were irrational and unscientific, brutal monsters. Why do we have Operation Paperclip to bring all their scientists over? That is, those two things don't make sense. Now, Quigley does briefly mention the Nazi loot, which I haven't gotten to the bottom of, where all this gold, right? We talked about this with Sean from Japan, the Japan gold situation. I've not really gotten to the bottom of that yet, but I don't doubt that there's some looting of gold on the part of the Allies. Now, here's an interesting section that I think should be mentioned as well, dealing with warfare. So, strategic bombing and the bombing of civilians, according to Quigley 799, comes out of the, as we mentioned earlier, the Italian general from World War I, Douhet, D-O-U-H-E-T. And Douhet proposed that the way to win all wars was strategic bombing of certain locations and the bombing of civilians. Now, guess what? The Axis powers and the Soviets rejected this. The U.S. and the British said, yes, let's bomb civilians. And this is an important turning point in the war, this approach, because the most intense bombing ever will be on Tokyo, the Tokyo fire raids that the Allies will do in bombing massive amounts of civilians. And so don't ever accept the hypocrisy of the Allied propaganda from World War II, because it's the Allies who accepted this principle of bombing civilians strategically. And guess what? Preemptive strikes is also part of the Douhet doctrine, and that's what the Allies favored. And guess what? That's what we still see in drone strikes that bomb weddings and kill everybody at the wedding. Preemptive strikes of Bush. This goes back to Douhet and the Allies. And so you can judge for yourself who's the hypocrite in that regard. Germany is economically crippled by 1945. The people themselves, the German people, interestingly, have not lost their morale. They continue to, even in the face of the civilian bombings in Germany, Quigley says they weren't fazed by this. So Hitler is more anti-Western than anti-Soviet, and that's because obviously the real source of power for the Allies is the U.S. It's not the Soviets. So he's more worried about the West. 1943 to 1945, the next section in Quigley, is the turning point in the closing in on Japan, and we're almost over. The war's almost over by now. So the total destruction of the Japanese Navy occurs at Midway. They're just wiped out. In the Pacific Theater, the Japanese in response engage in, of course, the famed kamikaze attacks. This actually does do quite a bit of damage to the Allies. The Tokyo attack of 1945 is the most devastating ever. 250,000 houses destroyed, civilians. 1 million people were made homeless, and 100,000 immediately killed. So, again, let's see, who are the hypocrites here? We mentioned earlier Yalta. Yalta, as we said, results in the UN Security Council and hands over the Far East to the Soviets. China, Quigley says in page 819, is extremely weak in this period, and they don't even really deserve to be called a great power, but at the behest of the U.S., they were included in the UN as a great power. Then we have this strange section about the A-bomb and the Manhattan Project, and I think that it's entirely rational to doubt what we're told about A-bombs and nukes, because number one, the Bikini Atoll and the Trinity site footage is clearly faked. It involves the blending of two different layers of explosions, and the footage was created at Lookout Mountain Studios, which we've detailed before, the Air Force studio that Dave McGowan talks about in his book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, which was basically involved in a lot of, we can surmise, wartime propaganda footage. Actually drove the home is now owned by Jared Leto, the actor, and I was in LA a few weeks ago, and we actually drove up Mulholland Drive into Wonderland Avenue, and I took pictures from the outside. I didn't go inside, but obviously of the Lookout Mountain facility where Jared Leto lives, and you can still see old memorabilia and signs that are there commemorating the Air Force Base. So it was an Air Force base, but it was basically devoted to filming and war propaganda, and all the top Hollywood directors had access to it. You can look it up, by the way. The Air Force themselves admit that the atomic footage is all created at Lookout Mountain Studios. Now, what's interesting is that also H.G. Wells is the father of the atomic bomb, and so this comes out of science fiction. Quigley even talks about it in a kind of fantastical science fiction way. He says that everyone was freaked out by this massive bomb that could destroy whole continents, and he says that what's interesting on page 820 that I think is another reason to be suspicious. I'm not making any certain conclusions of this. I'm just saying that, well, it looks like the footage that we see in these famous explosion scenarios is faked. Quigley says, guess what? They miraculously created these bombs within 3 weeks. He says that we didn't really have the technology, but we drew up this amazing, unbelievable weapon in 3 weeks. That's page 820 according to Quigley. So you can judge from that what you want to. And I'm not saying it's possible that the nuke bombs are not real. I mean, there could be very large scale conventional bombs like the V2 rockets that were dropped. That could be what was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the whole stories of radiation be fiction. That could all be true. There'd just be very intense combustion type bombs. It's also possible that nuclear energy is real, but that it doesn't have these tremendous explosive effects like we're told. It might create radiation. There might be leakage and so forth. But it not be this mega weapon, right? So I'm just saying that these are different possibilities. We don't know because we've never seen an actual nuke bomb go off. We've seen the A bomb and the hydrogen bomb supposed footage, but that footage, and it's even in the New York Times, those images are faked. There's a New York Times editorial, or excuse me, not editorial, an actual piece. The Hiroshima mushroom cloud that wasn't. That's faked footage. So here you have the establishment saying that, you judge from that what you want. My perspective, my opinion is that we don't really know what's going on with the physics and these particle accelerators. We have to go by what we're told, and we know that we're being told all this from known liars. So Manhattan Project seems, in my opinion, to be a very large-scale attempt at re-engineering the biosphere. And we get that from looking at Jonas Salk and his obsession with inoculations and vaccines and radiation studies. right? This is all under the Department of Energy, the Atomic Energy Commission, which is now the Department of Energy. The geoengineering plans, the chemtrails, the spraying, the so forth. This is all straight up. Dr. Teller, who's mentioned here in this book, the father of the bomb, who's also the inspiration for the Dr. Strangelove character in Kubrick's film. It's entirely possible to view it as a psyop, and Quigley says it is a psyop, but he doesn't say that he thinks it's totally fake. But there's indicators like, you created this thing in 3 weeks. Come on. I mean, we're told the Manhattan Project, took forever, and it was. But he also says, interestingly, Manhattan Project was completely super compartmentalized. So he says there were only about 8 or 12 people at the top that really knew what it was about, and the rest of the people had no idea what the total project was, because it was a whole bunch of different little things all across the country. So we don't really know what the Manhattan Project was about. It's very likely that it was high-level psyops. And you say, well, but what about all these Nobel Prize people? Well, if it was a psyop, you would be giving all the people involved in it Nobel Prizes, because that would give the appearance that these people are really doing and making all the discoveries that they claim. But when you think about it, who gets the Nobel Prize nowadays? Obama, right? So Nobel Prize is actually a means or a way of propagandizing, right? It's a way to sell some form of scientism or whatever. I'm not saying that all the people involved don't actually do science. There were real engineers involved in this, but what I'm saying is that we are, I think, legitimately within our epistemic rights to criticize and wonder, much like the Apollo missions and programs, how real this so-called space program and the nuke program, because they all kind of go together, the atomic obsession, how real it really was. And again, the post-war stuff and the post-war settlements were already drawn up in 1939 by the CFR, right? So you can see that we don't really know what to believe. And there was another article that just came out arguing that a lot of the World War II documentaries that are famous from the London Express, a guy wrote a book about 5 directors who were involved in staging that imagery. So what I'm saying is that when it comes to warfare stuff, I'm not saying that it's all fake. I'm saying that we oftentimes don't know, and so we have to take a kind of skeptical position, as I think the appropriate position. So I'm not saying that I know for sure, but I'm saying that you don't know for sure either, right? Unless you were involved in these projects. So we kind of have to make assumptions, educated guesses, and to the best of our abilities, try to figure out what's going on. That's why I did that interview with Dr. Farrell, talking about what might the CERN accelerator actually be involved in. Maybe it really does smash atoms together, but maybe it's also a cover for something else. I mean, that's entirely possible, and I think we should look at all the options. So Germany and Russia lose the most, Quigley says on page 827, and that was key because that was the plan of the globalists all along. So we've covered then World War II. That's how World War II went down in 1 hour brief. But you can, if you really want to dig into it, you can read those 200 pages from Quigley. I found them tremendously boring, not because World War II is boring, but because Quigley is not that great of a writer, and it's just so dry and technical in facts. But what we're going to talk about in this next section is very important, and it's the effects of World War II and how it set the stage for the modern world that we now live in and the coming globalist order, the oligarchical, Western-controlled New World Order, the New Age, and this is what Quigley calls it. And I mentioned a little bit of this in the last lecture because I was explaining how World War II would really set the stage for this through the UN and the idea of the global Cold War, which will become the global war on terror. And Quigley is actually going to kind of hint at that. He doesn't say war on terror, but he's going to explain what warfare will be like in the future. He's writing this in 1966, and there's actually going to be some really prophetic stuff, some surprising statements that Quigley makes in 1966 that describe our day. So Quigley certainly knew what was going on. There's no question there, because of his accurate predictions of the future. So he's going to talk about cybernetics. He's going to talk about AI, transhumanism, quantification, and mass computer implementation. He's going to talk about rationalization, and I'll explain what that means, what he means by that. He's going to talk about managerial rule by experts as the government of the future. Basically, he's going to project the dystopia. So that's what we're going to get with Quigley. And he's going to talk about how great all this liberalism is and how great the liberal order of the West has been. But then he's going to turn around and say, but it all leads to a non-liberal order. So all the liberalism that the bankers have funded, the wars for liberalism and freedom and democracy, are taking us into a scientific dictatorship where there's no freedom. So there you go. Again, more contradictions from Quigley. Now Quigley will talk about this later on in the last chapter in the book. And he's going to talk about the return to tradition, believe it or not. Yes, Quigley is going to say we've got to return to tradition, because he sees where all this goes. But he doesn't seem to make the connection between the fact that it's his liberalism that he's talking about that leads to the tyranny. That's what Aldous Huxley says in the introduction to Brave New World. He says, guess what? All your revolutions from the French Revolution to now are ending in the final revolution, which is the total smashing of you idiots who believed in the revolution. So you've been listening to Jay's analysis. We've covered World War II and Tragedy and Hope. And if you like what you hear, all of the lectures, the second hour is, of course, based on subscription. You can subscribe for $4.95 a month or $60 a year. A lot of people love it. 95% approval. You gotta subscribe if you really want to get into depth, because I save a lot of the good stuff for hour 2, because I think that's more fair to the people who subscribe. So we're going to get into rationalization and science and his meta-analysis of post-World War II era and his future projections, many of which were accurate. And we're going to talk about Darwinism and so forth as Quigley discusses it. And you can also pick up my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which is available for pre-order. It will be out in a couple months. Looking forward to that. That's definitely a book you need to get if you want to understand Hollywood and the whole meta-philosophy behind Hollywood, and what the movies are telling us in both good and bad ways. That's a great book for waking up your friends and family. And as I said, again, please subscribe to Jay's Analysis. You get access to all my past lectures, Plato, all the interviews, both hours, and you get all the Tragedy and Hope talks. And so this has been Tragedy and Hope, Hour 1, Part 6. Thank you for listening. The gods of the Atlantis establishment have dropped forth the dew of Olympus. Scientific technocracy, what does this mean? Well, Quigley lays it out in the chapter Rationalization and Science, page 836, and this is what we've been saying is coming. He says that the new order post-World War II, which really got it going, is the order of rationalization. Now, he's not talking about, he says here, Enlightenment rationalism. That would play a role in what would later be termed by Quigley rationalization, but he's talking about essentially the mechanization process, the process of quantification, mathematization of all of these areas of life that arise out of warfare. And so he says the new order is not based on metaphysics and ontology or philosophy. It's based on pragmatism and relativism. So we don't need any of that stuff anymore. We only need what works, and that's why the age of America is the age of pragmatism. And the only school of philosophy that America has produced is pragmatism. Yes, they pioneered that along with some other degenerates over in Europe and particularly the UK. But the pragmatism of the UK, as we've said many times, is directly connected to empiricism, and the empiricist philosophers and the materialist philosophers, atomist philosophers of Locke, Berkeley, Kant, Hume. All right, these are the characters. Now, Kant's a little bit, I'm just broadly putting him in there because he doesn't really count as an empiricist per se. But for our purposes here, he says that rationalization in the West, mechanization, this comes out of the relativistic British empiricist tradition that would influence the U.S. It's also the Masonic tradition too. So we can add that point. Taken together, these two facts, empiricism and rationalization, have played a significant role in the Western civilization, but have always remained somewhat peripheral to the experience of ordinary men. World War II, he says, made these philosophy ideas directly influence and affect the everyday living of the average American, or the average Western, because the industrialization of the war machine's giant engine, and all of that industry would be marshaled in the U.S. to supporting the war effort. And what this did was it prepared the way for the dominance of the technocratic scientific dictatorship. And that's what Quigley says right here in these 2 pages. Also important here is Fordism, or what we might call Taylorism, after the figure Frederick Winslow Taylor, who wrote The Principles of Scientific Management. And this is the idea of maximizing time, maximizing efficiency in factories and in industry so that we can get the maximum number of products in the minimal amount of time for the minimal cost, et cetera, et cetera. This is part of that process of rationalization. This is also covered in the famous book by Max Weber, The Spirit of Capitalism and Protestant Ethics, something to that effect. I read this back in my undergrad days, and I don't agree, obviously, with Weber's democratic socialism, but Weber is right when he talks about the rationalization process, and that's what Quigley's talking about. They're talking about the exact same thing. So don't get caught up in somebody's politics, because they're talking about the same thing. I've been talking about this for a while. We can look as well at important thinkers like Rene Guénon, the perennial traditionalist school, who wrote his book about the process of quantification of all reality that results from the materialism and the atomism and the empiricism of the West, the pragmatism. It leads to this idea that you can quantify everything, and everything is under the dominance of will to power just by the pragmatic state. Quantification and warfare. That's what's key to the shift in the social outworking in the West. How can we, the reason that we get this is because of what warfare wants is the maximum death ratio, right? What bomb can be dropped at what height with what TNT mass or whatever to get the maximum kill ratio. And that's what leads to the continual process of quantification in all the sciences and in industry. So the calculated, they have equations. I'm not joking, for like maximum death ratios. So you're talking about straight up culture industry of death here, and them coming up with maximum kill ratios. And so what develops is the U.S. institutes this idea of adopting the total 100% policy and philosophy of scientific dictatorship, and they create the National Academy of Sciences. Well, actually, that was founded in 1863, but it comes to a new prominent role with new bodies such as the National Research Council. And in 1938, Vannevar Bush, professor of electrical engineering, vice president of MIT, and he begins to develop analysis calculations using differential calculus at the NACA, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. So aerospace engineering takes on a new important role here. As France fell, Bush persuaded President Roosevelt to create the National Defense Research Committee. So I mean, it's just all these committees get created, pop up. And who do we see here? Bush, Rockefeller, Bell Labs, MIT, James Conant, president of Harvard. This is all the CIA grounds, right? Yale, Spooktown. California, Caltech, which is the rocket programs and so forth. And the Harvard Byzantine Research Center. That's interesting. I didn't know there was a Harvard Byzantine Research Center, but this is all part of the rise of the military-industrial complex, and this comes out of World War II. The military-industrial academic complex we must mention. Vannevar Bush. Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, is created. Millions and millions and millions and millions, $500 million in the World War II period are put into this R&D, research and development. So this is the beginning of, now there was obviously there were already industrialists, and military industrial complex had a kind of role prior to this as monopolistic companies. Now the government is intimately tied into the monopolistic companies for all of these committees and research teams and scientific developments and so forth. This is also where we're going to get MK Ultra, which is tied into the Manhattan Project. So MIT gets a huge amount of money from John D. Rockefeller. This is page 841. And the idea is large-scale innovation and development in all areas of life, hence scientific dictatorship. Scientism, the new religion of America, post-World War II. Now, it was already, but it's really beginning to take on a new role. This is why the military-industrial complex nowadays is 100% completely promotes the atheism, scientism, Darwinism, and so forth of Hawkins, Dennett, Harris, Neil deGrasse Tyson, all these frontman characters, popular pop science figures. The Anglo-American method of rationalization and science. That is what is crucial here. And does this not vindicate Dugin's thesis? This is what Dugan says. So anybody who has a problem with this, I mean, Quigley backs it up. He says that's what's going on. That's what runs the world. President Conant of Harvard and Vannevar Bush as chairman of the New Weapons Committee. So there's another new committee, the New Weapons Committee. This is what leads to the RAND Corporation. The best known example of all this committee stuff is the RAND Corporation, a private research development firm under the contract of the United States Air Force, concerned with rationalization techniques in politics and all areas of life. This is what would revamp America, the RAND Corporation, through the Cold War. Now, he gives an example of this. And he says similar think tanks arose in Britain as well. One of the most complex applications of the techniques of Operation Bootstrap by the RAND Corporation was the Puerto Rican industry being revitalized and reformatted as a test bed by Arthur D. Little Incorporated, which sought to transform the entire Puerto Rican economy. So they use this as a kind of a small, laboratory for what they would try, what they would do in the U.S. in the succeeding decades. A great impetus was given by rationalization through warfare and mathematics, quantification of all reality, and the application, as I've said many times, of game theory, formation theory, symbolic logic, cybernetics. This is 1966. And Hungarian refugee mathematician John von Neumann at the Institute for Advanced Study. Mathematical methods could then be applied to decision-making process, and this is where we get rational choice theory, Beautiful Mind, the movie with Russell Crowe as what's his face? I'm talking about the crazy mathematics guy, John. I just went blank, but what I'm talking about, the guy from Beautiful Mind. I've written articles about it, but about game theory and rational choice theory and stuff. That dude, whatever his name was, we'll just call him Russell Crowe. So cybernetics, game theory, this is interesting. This is the 60s, and so this was really in the realm for most people of science fiction, and Quigley saying no, it's going to be brought into reality. He also mentions the famous philosopher William Van Orman Quine, Mathematical Logic, which he published. And Quine is funny because he's one of these goofball radical empiricists who catches on and wrote this famous essay about empiricism and how you can't justify anything logically from empirical presuppositions. That's really funny. I mean, if you take philosophy in college, you'll study W.V.O. Quine and his famous essays. And so what does Quine say? Well, he says, actually, you can't justify anything in terms of symbolic logic through empiricism. It's completely contradictory. So he's actually echoing the consistency that David Hume talked about when he said we can't really justify the future. We can't justify the principle of induction in philosophy based on past instances because that's circular logic. So actually, empiricism ends in it's a complete dead end, and that's why he says, so just forget about philosophy, even forget about logic, because it doesn't really matter. What matters is pragmatism. Yeah, you can do mathematics and symbolic logic, but I mean, you've got to just give up on making sense of how these things actually work. Quine restates that in his famous essays. They're really famous essays in the history of philosophy. The rise of the computer, the personal computer, which is what did not exist in 1966, but Quigley kind of says that this rationalization and computerization is going to be in all areas of life eventually. So here we get to that kind of predictive area. Vannevar Bush and Paul Conant, these Eastern establishment elites, he says, kind of set a new stage for how security would be run, and what's the word I want here? Not mind control, but how the establishment would run its operations. And he says, no longer in this older model of the OSS, but rather now the new model of the NGOs and the think tanks and the research and development and the academic institutions. Not so much this running around doing espionage type stuff, but rather the focus on large-scale psyops from the think tanks and foundations and NGOs, Grand Corporations, and so forth. And he says that Vannevar Bush and Paul Conant pioneered this new way of doing things in contrast to the older model of the OSS and presumably what would then become the CIA. I guess that's why they would take over things like drug networks, right? And mass media psyops type stuff. And meanwhile, the real power is going to be the later National Security Council and things like that. So, but interesting here, Vannevar Bush is such a prominent figure. Now, if page 844 is interesting because even though he doesn't mention the Royal Society, he says what I've been saying. He says all of these methods of scientism, basically, that the U.S. adopts is the teaching of the Royal Society from all of its big name characters all the way back to the 1600s, is what Quigley says. Now, no, wait, does he say 1600s? No, he doesn't, excuse me, he doesn't say 1600s, but he does talk about the people from the Royal Society, Oxford's Sir Robert Watson Watt, Professor Frederick Lindemann, Lord Chertwell, these different Royal Society characters. And then he goes on to talk about Cambridge and Oxford playing a central role in the UK in promoting all these methodologies. And so that's what we're looking at here is, again, that British empiricist long tradition of Anglo pragmatism. And that's what Dugin is so constantly critical of, and I think rightly so, because the anti-metaphysics and the situational ethics that arise from this is really the heart of the liberalism of the West and the radical atomistic individualism that comes out of this laissez-faire empiricist philosophy, materialism and all this. I mean, this is all straight, just constant, pumped out from the Royal Society for hundreds of years now. Now we come to the bomb almighty, and if you watched, what is it, Planet of the Apes 2 or 3, they have the hail the bomb almighty. They're worshiping the nuke bomb, which in that, series, that dystopian series, it's kind of, I can't remember, they're on a different planet or something, right? But anyway, it's been a while since I've watched Planet of the Apes, but it's like a different planet that the astronauts went to, and history's kind of, it's like an alternate version of history, where the apes evolved instead of men, and the men are kind of put in cages like the apes. But then by like part 2 or 3, it turns into this weird bomb cult where they worship the nuke bomb, and it's interesting because I like all those 60s and 70s dystopian films. But what's funny is that Quigley says that the A bomb and the H bomb do kind of take on this role of a new, the great power of the gods, because the belief is, that this bomb can, and all the propaganda around it, the bomb can like cut the planet in half. I mean, come on. there's no bomb that's going to cut the planet in half. But a lot of people believe this based on the psychological operations surrounding the bomb. And I think too, there's a Nobel racket, as I mentioned in hour one. There's got to be some kind of racket involved in this. If Obama gets a Nobel Prize, and they've been giving out Nobel Prize, if it's corrupt nowadays with giving Obama one, it has to have been corrupt for a long time. So we can't really rely on the fact that the physicists involved in Manhattan Project got Nobel Prizes, because I mean that could just be propaganda. And you've got shady figures here. Who have we got here? Who kind of gets this going? Alexander Sachs, the banker, is who gets the message to Roosevelt about Dr. Edward Teller, the father of geoengineering, by the way, and his designs for this bomb. And they've already been doing radiation studies for a while, so supposedly they're looking into uranium and how they can use uranium fission, fusion, all this stuff. There's a lot of technical aspects of this part that's kind of weird, but one thing that's funny is Quigley, I don't understand don't get mad at me for saying this, I don't understand, but Quigley says they magically, miraculously got together, the scientists got together, and it only took them 3 weeks. There's a little more leeway there. 3 weeks to come up with how to make the bomb. Now, he's not saying they made the bomb, but they figured it out in 3 weeks. And he said, "Oh wow, what ingenuity and industry, right? It only took 3 weeks. It was magical." So that makes me kind of suspicious here. And we've got the background, Vannevar Bush, E.O. Lawrence, who supposedly invented the particle accelerator, or cyclotron, I think. And Quigley says only 12 people knew what was really going on with Manhattan Project. Only 12 really knew. So he said there was intense compartmentalization of all aspects of the Manhattan Project. He mentions Oak Ridge, Tennessee, not too far from here, which is now, of course, the NSA supercomputer lab. He says by 1945, everyone concerned with the bomb worked 24 hours around the clock. That sounds like propaganda to me. Even today, American security is trying to keep secret facts in relationship to the Manhattan Project. So even in 1966, there were still aspects of Manhattan Project that were classified. Then he says, great page 860, most of the atomic spying stories, at least in the 1945 to 50 era, Quigley says, they're fake. They're Hollywood bullshit, he says, created by the FBI in Hollywood in tandem with the FBI, because in this period the FBI was working very intently with Hollywood figures, Jimmy Stewart, Cary Grant, right? I mentioned this before. But he says most of those subsequent publicity on atomic spying is based on these Hollywood stories. And he mentions some movie I'd never seen, House on 92nd Street. And this is Nazi espionage networks trying to steal secrets of the A-bomb and all this stuff. But Quigley says most of these stories are accepted by gospel, but they're from Hollywood. So, on the next page, 861, he says there were 2 stories from this 45 to 50 period that actually have any truth to them. So, yeah, do with that what you want. That's what Quigley says. Man, mega compartmentalization, he says on the next section here, the 20th century patterns, that was crucial to how the Manhattan Project was run. Mega compartmentalization. And he says only these 12 top people knew the totality of the project. And so everybody else was working on these, over here in Oak Ridge, other people over at Los Alamos, working on a trigger for the bomb, supposedly. Nobody knew what this whole shebang was really about. Now, Quigley says that also, strange statement, 863, the bombing of Japan was not necessary because Japan was not going to win the war, but they wanted to go ahead and drop the bomb to freak them all out as a psyop. Interesting. And what did this do? Well, it terrified the whole world, terrified all of Eurasia. But Quigley says, yeah, we did bomb the shit out of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and yeah, it's pretty bad, but the world's better off for it. That's what he says. So, hypocrisy on the part of Quigley. Now, in 1966, page 865, there's an interesting comment about, he says, the future of all this rationalization will be the predominance of information warfare and information tech. He says that's the future. And he's right about that, wasn't he? The internet. And, wow, if you've read my analysis of The Prisoner, the 60s espionage sci-fi dystopia series from the UK, great cult series, you got to watch that and read my analysis if you haven't. Quigley says exactly what Patrick McGowan from the series says. He says, the future of man is to be reduced to automatons, to a complicated nexus of expensive machines, as is shown in some sci-fi book he mentions here from the 60s called Failsafe. He says that's the future. The expert will replace the individual tycoon in the economic system. He will replace the democratic voter in control of the political system. This planning may be single or unified, but it will all be a planned society. Planned-opolis, Quigley says. Now, experts will run everything. It's going to be a total dystopia. Freedom of choice will be limited or controlled. He says maybe there'll be some freedom of choice. I'm not joking here. Quigley actually says the best you can hope for is to choose between two controlled parties. I'm not joking. He says that right here on page 866. At least we can hope that the man of the future in his democratic freedom will at least be able to choose between two controlled parties. I'm not joking. What does he say this model is? Neo-feudalism. He explicitly says it, page 867. Neo-feudalism. Now, Cold War and the nukes are important because what do? They destroy tradition. Quigley says how? It wipes out the totality of how international law and international relations and nationhood was understood from the time of the Renaissance forward. That's another key aspect of the Cold War. Now, I'm not saying that international law was good and real and great, but what I'm saying is that regardless of that question, Quigley is explicitly saying that the next phase or stage that the Cold War initiated and brought about was the end of the old order of nation states and international law, and what it resulted in was a new phase of the bipolar, and is eventually intended to be unipolar, world, where you have proxy wars, proxy states, the Cold War leading directly to the War on Terror, and this is initiated by the dullest machinations in the Cold War. That the UN, of course, playing a big role in this. So page 867 is key. That's a big page here. So there's no longer such thing as the traditional combatant. There's now no distinction between the civilian and the combatant. And that's why we can have preemptive strikes, the Duhay Doctrine, and the bombing of civilians and drone strikes on people at weddings and so forth. This is the new stage of warfare that the Cold War initiated post-World War II. The traditional international law and the understandings of what statehood and nationhood was are destroyed after the Cold War. That's what Quigley says, or in the Cold War. All the way back to the time of Hugo Grotius and the classical Renaissance understanding of international law wiped away. Now you get big, massive power blocks that fund and initiate all the coups and revolutions in the client satellite states. Most of these losses were not obvious, but there are others. The growth of international law in the late medieval and Renaissance period is now, which were a reaction against the feudal period, he says, are now done away with. Now, this is what's key. This is what's important. Under the umbrella of the nuclear stalemate, the boundaries of the old states are all shattered by guerrilla conflicts that are supported by outsiders. Outside governments subsidize modern murders and revolts, as the Russians did in Iraq in 1958, as Nasser did in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Yemen, And as elsewhere in the period after 1953, as the American CIA did in Iran and in Guatemala. Iran 1953, Guatemala 1954, very successfully, as in the Cuban invasion, April, or unsuccessfully in the Cuban invasion of 1961. Now, I don't believe that the Bay of Pigs was actually a failure; it was a great success. If you read Servando Gonzalez's book, Psychological Warfare in the New World Order, positing that Castro is actually a CFR agent. Now, this is key. Areas can obtain recognition as being states without the need to demonstrate the traditional characteristics of statehood, namely the ability to maintain their frontiers. This classical ideas of what a state was, and by the force of ability to maintain order within the borders. They can do this by securing the intervention of one of the great powers, an outside power. And this now completely redefines the notion of a state. Now, how is that relevant? ISIS. ISIS is not a traditional state, but they're called the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, whatever. That's because they can achieve this new definition of what the status of statehood is, because they're supported by the power. What great power is that? I wonder who supports ISIS. So, the new feudalism, by the way, keep in mind, Quigley says that after this 50s period, all the coups, guerrillas, revolutionary movements, regime changes, they're all supported by external foreign powers. And that would mean, obviously, only you've got two options, Soviets in this period, or the U.S. In this way, nuclear stalemate in the Cold War carried out the total destruction of international traditional law and the gradual loss of meaning for what the established concepts of state and public authority were, and it opened the door to the new feudalization and authority somewhat similar to what the founders of the modern state system of international law had sought to overcome in the period of the Renaissance and the prior feudal period. So there you go. Quigley says we are in a new feudal period. Cold War is all about psyops, Quigley says, and fear. Now, he doesn't say it's all about psyops, but I'm saying that it's all about psyops. And he mentions on page 875 the role that Hollywood would play in hyping up the fear of the Cold War and the ability of nuke bombs. This is a lot of Hollywood, he says. Well, he hints at that. So then we get this intercontinental ballistic missile war phase. And my uncle actually played a role in that. He was the first to overhear Russian transmissions that spoke of the launch of an ICBM. So my uncle was famous for that. He's not known publicly for doing that, but that was his role in Air Force intelligence back in the Cold War period. He would fly from Turkey, and they would listen in these commercial jets or airliners over the Russian areas where they were testing these missiles, and so he overheard this. So there you go. There's the next section of Quigley. So what we've seen, to recap, is the basic principle that World War II was crucial for, first of all, being the second stage of what World War II did, or World War I did, with creating the three-block model. World War II initiates the two-block model of Eurasia versus the West. And then the Cold War is all about the theory of that all these CFR stooges are going to say is convergence, right? The blending of Eastern Sovietism with Western capitalism. And we're going to see that at meetings such as the 1988 meeting at Malta. We mentioned Malta before, between John Paul II, Gorbachev, and Bush Sr. That's an important meeting that not a lot of people know about, but that was a big-scale geopolitical discussion of the wise men of the West in terms of how it's time to end this Cold War and blend the two together. And now, what we've seen nowadays, regardless of Putin's motivations or what you think of Putin, is rather that there is a large reaction, I think, amongst the people of Russia. Don't worry about the fifth column of agitators or compromised pro Fortune 100 persons in Russia. It's more so the mass of the Christian population that I think reflects what we're seeing in this opposition on the part of Russia and some of its satellite groups, Serbia and so forth. So that's my justification for why I would be, quote, pro-Russian. It has nothing to do with mafia or anything like that. It has to do with the geopolitical stratagem of that the leaders of the West are completely satanic. And they openly talk about at times how they want to destroy Russia because of its Christian population. Don't worry about the leaders. Set that aside for a moment. You know, Dugin even says a lot of the political elite in Russia are completely Western. Forget about that. It's about those large population of the Orthodox Christians, as well as the resources and what Russia represents and what Eurasia represents, according to Brzezinski, as the key to controlling the world, right? The Eurasian landmass. So Quigley explained to us then how the Atlanticists essentially, and that's my interpretation of Quigley, that the Atlanticists essentially understood that 2 great world wars would completely re-engineer society. It would change over into a consumer society instead of an industrial society. The CFR Royal Society planners understood that they could weaken and kill a lot of Germans and Russians in these giant wars. They could get all these nations into tremendous debt to the bankers for generations. They could essentially create the New World Order out of World War I and II, and that's what's crucial. Now, what is the New World Order? According to Quigley, it's what Aldous Huxley talks about. It's a scientific dictatorship run by machines, mechanization, automatons, he says, cybernetics. That's the future transhumanism. All this Rand Corporation military-industrial complex, quantification of everything that Rene Guénon talked about, that is the future. Even as Quigley said in 1966, we live in that era now, and it's even going to get more centralized into the plandopolis, planned and controlled economy, the plan and control society. No freedoms, he says, except for the fake freedom to choose between Coke and Pepsi, the Democrats and Republicans. That's what Quigley says. And so that scientific managerial society, he says, is what results from all the freedom that Quigley himself is an apologist for and that he promised. Well, it ends in tyranny. And that's exactly what Dostoevsky said. So thank you for listening. We will return very soon to the next section of Tragedy and Hope, where we're going to get into more of the Cold War and the espionage and the deep state aspects of the Cold War, and again how this was all set up at Yalta and Potsdam to arrange the world so that the Soviet threat would be built up and the Soviets would have this giant chunk of the world to be the new threat, just like the way that they coaxed Hitler into doing what he did. So moving into Poland, moving into these other areas, this is the auspices for which the war is going to be fought. All along the Cliveden set, Washington, the industrialists, the British intelligence agents, they're saying, let Hitler do it. Take it, Hitler. Go baby, go. Do your thing. Then after he does his thing, he's a threat. He's the great dictator. We got to stop him. This is the great war to destroy the freedom of the West. And just the nefarious. I think the reason, and this has been talked about in espionage between Russia and the UK for centuries, the reason that these Western elites are so successful is because they're so devious. I mean, the other nations, like Hitler, for example, or the Russians, they can't fathom the levels of deception and subterfuge and hypocrisy to which the Atlanticist powers are willing to stoop so often. And that tends to be the downfall, because they don't expect them to be so double-handed. And yet they are, beyond anybody else's imagination. So it's almost as if the Atlanticist powers gain the upper hand in the 20th century because they're the most satanic. And I think that's Dugin's analysis in his I guess this kind of popular clip that's gone around the internet for a while, for a few years, where he says the West is pure Satanism. And he says that because of what I'm talking about. He's not talking about the average person in the street being a Satanist. He's talking about the philosophical ideology that undergirds all of what we're talking about, Atlanticism, and what the Atlanticist powers represent as the merchant sea power, British Empire, over against the metaphysical stability of the land power represented by Eurasia. Now, that's a metaphorical picture, so don't read too much into that as if we're saying like Atlantis is real or something. No, it's rather the symbolic, classical representations of Atlantis as the, this mythical land of advanced technology or whatever, the sea power, Atlantis, versus these land power. And you can see, if you live and grow up as a land power, that life is stable. There's a rhythm to things, and there's fixity, there's stasis, there's objective truth, there's metaphysics. The sea power, the merchant power, it's all about exchange, it's about mammon, it's about goods, and it's about pragmatism and deviousness, and you can see the pathology that would develop in these two different types of societies. Now, I'm not calling the U.S. really a sea power per se. It's more so he's talking about the British Empire. But the U.S. is that successor to that British Empire, and it takes on the role of being the engine of the older model of the British Empire. And so that's the new imperium, the postmodern imperium, that's supposed to be about Enlightenment rationalism. That's the birth of America, of course. But over time, what it becomes is the postmodern imperium. And the postmodern imperium is no longer even that concerned about its mythology. Its mythology is the PNAC, tried to reinvigorate the American mythos, the American mythology. I guess you could argue how successful that's been. Maybe Trump represents a kind of end to that mythology. But we also see from the absurdity and the theatrics of the modern political spectrum that it is a postmodern imperium. I mean, they don't even have pretenses anymore about what they do with the drone strikes, what they do with Syria, what they do in these foreign countries, and it's really sad, and it's beyond, I think, what previous empires were. It's a new level, because it's not like the Roman Empire and believing that the emperor is God on earth. It's now totally devious mad scientists that have all of the technological means at their disposal for mind control and global domination. And so what we've seen too is out of World War II and through the subsequent decades, the Cold War, the U.S. is going to set up all these bases all over the world. 150 something that we know about or more. Who knows what bases we don't know about, right? I mean, there's like hidden bases and things like this as well. So anytime with that many bases across the globe, when you put into perspective, and then you look at, say, how many aircraft carriers or naval ships the U.S. has in its Navy as opposed to Russia, and it's like Russia has like 1/8 or 1/7 of what the U.S. has. Russia has like a minuscule amount of bases compared to what the U.S. has. When you see the news present all of these global threats, North Korea, which is a total CIA-run state, fake. When you look at Russia, when you look at China, the news threats are so ridiculous when you consider the American bases that are across the globe. There's not a real threat. Nobody is ever going to invade the U.S. It's impossible to invade the U.S. So, no, we're not talking about open borders here. We're talking about military invasion. That's not ever going to happen. So most of these news threats, they're completely created nonsense. The ideas in the constantly in the Western media of Putin as Hitler and Putin as the great threat to America are utterly ludicrous. That's all nonsense. So once we understand all that and we understand what Quigley says, we get a different picture of how the world really works. And that's what I want to stress with these talks, is that it's not what you're told. It's not what you've been raised to know. Quigley's giving you the CFR archives and their picture of the 20th century, and that's much more accurate. Even though, as I've said many times, every time I do one of these lectures, somebody messages me or mentions that Quigley's propaganda. Dude, I say it in every talk that he's propaganda, but we still get a picture of a better picture, more accurate picture of the 20th century from Quigley than we will from any of the the mainline historians. There's no universities are reading this book. Okay, I mean, I had several 20th century history classes in college. You're not reading Carroll Quigley. I guarantee you that. I checked this book out from my library. The last dude that had checked it out was 1987. And prior to that, last time it was checked out was the 70s. So your professors are not checking out this book. So they're all a bunch of idiots. They're kept in their little boxes of understanding World War I and II. And they're taught the official academic history. All they had to do is go to the library and they could find Tragedy and Hope. They don't do it. So out of my university, I'm going to brag a little bit here, in the last 30 years, me and 2 other dudes have checked out this book. So there you go. Now, next time, we're going to get into the Cold War. As I said, it's going to be neat. A lot of spy stories, a lot of cool stuff there. Not all fake, not all Hollywood. Quigley does say that in the 1945 to 50 period, a lot of it, those atomic spying stories are fake. But we are going to get into some real espionage. There is some reality to that. There's a lot of nuke talk in Quigley. So we're going to have to wade through that as well. But thank you for listening. You've been listening to Jay's Analysis, and this is Lecture 6, Tragedy and Hope. Tell your friends.